everybody, welcome back to AP Psychology with me, Miss Baines, your teacher, where you can take advantage of being able to pause and rewind me as I deliver you our latest content. So go ahead and grab those markers, get yourself in a nice comfy space, and of course, don't forget those ever important binder notes that go in lockstep order with this video, which is Unit 5, Video 6, Thinking and Problem Solving. I'll see you on the other side. So we're moving right along and moving on to thinking and problem solving, which is all about thinking, right? And we've talked now about memory and forgetting. Now let's move forward to cognition itself, and that's what leads us to problem solving. There's lots of different things to think about here. So thinking or cognition refers to a process that involves knowing, understanding, remembering, and communicating all of these things. These are the kind of buzzwords for cognition. So concepts are the big overreaching concept or term that we have to start with are concepts. The mental groupings of similar objects, events, ideas, or people. Well, let me give you an example. There are a variety of, say, chairs, right? But they all have common features, right? Define the concept of chairs, okay? There's a category, right, we have in our brain, and we know that some common features would be a seat, legs, a back, right? Some are rock hard, some recline, some are domed, right? So a chair, when you see it, even though you might be seeing a different kind of chair for the first time, you can think to yourself, well, that's just a different kind of chair, but it's still a chair. You get it because it's a concept. So the development of concepts that we form, most people rely on the concept by forming some kind of definition. For example, a triangle is a shape that has 3 lines for sides. Bam, you get it. But most of you form concepts by a mental image or the best example, what we call our prototype. For example, a robin might be the prototype of a bird, but penguin or ostrich really isn't, right? When you think of the word bird, the first thing that would normally pop into the average person's mental image would be something like this, right? A robin, or a blackbird or a blue jay or something like that. Right, the birds we see flying around all the time. So once again, prototypes are your mental image or best example that you have for a concept. Concepts tend to be mentally represented as schemas, and I don't want you to confuse prototype and schema. Your prototype is your mental image that's literally in your brain, and it's your best example. Your schema, now write this down, your schema is the list of characteristics of that concept. So let me review a little bit more. Go ahead and go to the 3-tier graphic organizer in your notes right now. Concepts would be the big overarching category, right? It's the category of whatever the idea is, okay? So bird, let's say your schema is underneath the concept. Right? So your schema would be the list of characteristics of that concept. So for bird, birds have feathers, they have a beak, it has little feet, right? Sometimes they can fly, sometimes not. That is your schema, and your prototype is your mental image or your best example that you have already in your brain. So schemas help us understand what the concept is, often cause us to generate expectations about what that concept does. So let's take a look at the concept of, say, a police officer. What is your prototype or mental image of an officer? Maybe you have a family member who's a cop, or maybe you watch a show called Cops on Saturday night and you think one of those people. You think of one of those people. Or maybe you think of private detectives, right, that dress up not in a uniform, and they are all in your favorite movies or true crime series that you watch, right? Some of the common features that all of them have, though, would be the schema, right? If they wear a uniform, they would have a badge, they would wear a hat, they would carry a gun or a gun belt. Most of the time, or often, they are male. And that's what you think of when you develop that schema or characteristics of police officers when it first comes to mind in your head. Some other things we might expect of a schema: many cops also help people who are in need, or make sure traffic is flowing correctly. Many drive a car and pull people over if they're speeding or doing something bad. When we start to have expectations about what all cops do, so we're going to get back to this whole concept of schema, but we're going to kind of segue here to problem solving. There are 3 ways to solve problems. One we call an algorithm, but we're not talking about it with math, although it could be a methodological, logical rule or procedure that guarantees solving a particular math problem. So algorithms will exhaust all possibilities before arriving to a solution. They take a really long time. Computers use algorithms too, right? It's how you exhaust all possibilities before arriving at the solution. Let's say you wanted to find oatmeal cereal at the grocery store. And here's our example, right? If we were using an algorithm, you would walk into the store and search every single aisle, and then every single shelf, and every single box, until you ran into the one that said oat milk across the box. That would be an algorithm in real life, right? In real life, a heuristic, however, this is a little bit more simple thinking strategy that often allows us to make judgments and solve problems efficiently, okay? So they don't take as long as algorithms, and they enhance the likelihood of success. They cannot ensure it. So that's the difference between an algorithm. With an algorithm, you're guaranteed to solve the problem at some point, right? Because you're checking everywhere. With a heuristic, there are more error-prone outcomes than algorithms. So an example being, if you were trying to find the oatmeal and say you wanted to use a heuristic, you would maybe go and read the signs at the end of each aisle and look for the cereal that way. Or you would look in the aisle where you saw other things that go in the groups of cereals or baking or things like that. It's not going to take you as long, and hopefully if it's listed cereal on one of the aisle signs, you'll go in there and retrieve it much quicker. However, what if oatmeal went on sale that week and they moved it to the end of the last aisle, right, as you're about to check out, because it's this really great sale and they want you to grab a couple of boxes and they take up a lot of space on your way out, right? It didn't solve the problem until after you've already decided to get something else because they didn't have oatmeal, okay? So heuristics, sometimes it gets the job done, but sometimes it doesn't. Not everything is being looked at, right? Because when you take a shortcut. Okay, insight is our next concept. Insight, we've kind of talked about insight before with Kohler's chimpanzees. Insight involves a sudden, new, or novel, right? A novel realization of a solution to a problem, right? That's your insight, is your aha moment. You'll often need some prior experience and initial trial and error period of time to gain some insight, right, in order to solve a problem. Through insight with humans and animals, just like we saw learning back in Unit 4, the brain imaging and the studies suggest that insight strikes, right, and it's like a light bulb turning on. Right at that aha moment, it activates the right temporal cortex, right? So it's that time between not knowing the solution to knowing the solution. It's that moment that that chimpanzee reached for a hook to get the bananas because he wasn't tall enough, or to put the boxes on top of each other. Said, I can solve this, right? So we kind of talked about thinking. Now let's talk about where our thinking can go wrong. Really, our thinking can be the obstacles with solving problems. Fixation is a kind of broad term for a couple of things that we're going to talk about. Fixation is the inability to see a problem from a fresh perspective, right? The impediment is an impediment to solving the problem, right? And 2 examples are, one being mental set. Your mental set, we kind of talked about perpetual set in our sensory and perception unit, but our mental set is the tendency for old patterns of problem solving to persist, and they make it impossible for you to be able to see new ways to solve a new problem. Let me give you an example. It's kind of a silly example, but just so you know how you walk up to, say, Target, and there's two sets of double doors. One set is automatic, the other set is not, okay? And you're thinking it's automatic, right? They should open. Well, your mental set is probably going to have like maybe a stomping on the floor to make the doors open, or maybe you walk back and go walking back up again to try it again, and then walk back and try it again. You're so used to automatic doors, you don't realize that you're in front of a regular door. And or your mental set prevents you from just pushing the door and opening it, right? This is a kind of silly example of mental set. Another one is functional fixedness. Is the tendency to think of the only familiar functions for objects, okay? So for instance, can you name the many different ways you could use a table fork? How about Ariel in The Little Mermaid, who uses the fork to comb her hair? She does not suffer from functional fixedness, right? She's creative. She finds a creative use to use the fork to get the knots out of her hair. To get this clear in your brain, someone who suffers from functional fixedness, let's say that they're looking for their keys, and all they bring out of their pocket instead of their keys is some change and a paperclip, right? And they are thinking to themselves, how am I going to get into this lock without my key? But you don't realize that a paperclip can easily solve the problem of unlocking the door without a key, right? You can use that little tiny paperclip to play around in there and possibly open up the door, unless it's a really high-tech type of lock, okay? The next concept that we're going to talk about is confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is the tendency to search for information that confirms or proves a personal bias. So we seek evidence to support the ideas, and we dismiss evidence that doesn't support our side. So for instance, you believe your boyfriend is faithful to you, right? You trust in him, and you'd rather that than notice that he's over there receiving text messages from maybe some other girl, that he isn't as available for dates as he once was, and he used to pay you a lot more attention, and the fact that he used to call you once a day, and now he rarely ever calls you, you start to wonder about when he used to bring you flowers and took you out on dates, right? So you believe your boyfriend is faithful, using and misusing heuristics. Now, we're going to talk a little bit more about heuristics for thinking and problem solving in ways other than you might think of in the more logical or mathematical ways. There's two kinds of heuristics that have been identified by cognitive psychologists. Availability heuristics often help us solve problems, but they can also bias our judgment, and we're going to talk about that. And a representativeness heuristic is judging the likelihood of things or objects in terms of how well they seem to represent, hence the name of the word heuristic, or to match a particular prototype. It allows people to make quick judgments, and we do this all the time, right? But let's talk about how it's going to get us in trouble. With representative heuristics, you have to think about the prototype, right? You have to think about that original thing that you're experiencing, the new objects or ideas or events or things. When you make judgments, does it all fit my prototype? Here's an example. If you were to meet a man dressed in slacks and kind of an argyle sweater, who's small in stature and wears gold-rimmed glasses and is somewhat soft-spoken and a little bit shy and timid, would you say that that man is your prototype for a construction worker or perhaps a librarian, right? Which fits the prototype of librarian better? Maybe it led you down the wrong path, though, because you have a prototype in your head of female librarians. Always there being throughout your history of your life, there's always been female in that position. So that sort of shows you an example of how prototypes can sometimes be a little bit. So if he's a construction worker, that's kind of led you down the wrong path, right? To an error, because you're judging based off your own prototype, and that's representativeness heuristic. Availability heuristic is a cognitive shortcut in which the probability of an event is determined by how easily that event can be brought to mind. It's how available that name is, how available the information is inside your brain. So you choose the alternative that is most mentally available. Here's an example. People are usually more afraid of dying in a plane crash than in an automobile accident. Despite the fact that it's exponentially more dangerous to ride in a car, the reason being that plane crashes receive much more publicity, right? And therefore we think, oh my God, that's just so awful. Look at that. And so many more people died in a plane crash, and everybody's super afraid that even though we're 10 million times more likely to be harmed in a car crash, maybe not that much more, but much more likely to be harmed in a car crash than a plane crash. Okay, next up is overconfidence. We've talked about this a little bit way back when it was our tendency to overestimate the accuracy of one's beliefs and judgments. So think about the last project you had to do, and how long did you think it was going to take you when you first looked at it, right? Probably a lot shorter than you had anticipated. Many times people overestimate, say, how much weight they can lift or how many exercises they can do, right? All of us go in thinking that we can do a lot more than our limitations of our body and mind allow us to. Overconfidence is also associated with happiness and making tough decisions easier, thinking that everything is going to be fine, everything's going to work out in the end, which can help to keep us from worrying. Right? If we're overly confident, we push the bad thoughts out of our mind, and then we're that much happier when it turns out that it wasn't so bad after all. Overconfidence or exaggerated fear. Exaggerated fear is opposite of overconfidence. For exaggerated fear, things may happen, such as fears maybe that you found exaggerated fear opposed to overconfidence is a tendency for you might exaggerate how things may happen. An example might be that you found out after the 9/11 crash, it led to a decline in air travel due to the fear of even a likelihood of it happening again. Even though that likelihood was minuscule, people didn't want to fly. Framing decisions. Decisions or framing as a vocabulary term in general is how an issue is presented. It can significantly affect decisions and judgments, and we've talked about priming before, but let's talk about framing now a little bit. Framing is the exact same issue in two different ways that can produce two very different results. The more positive you make it sound, the more people will respond to it. So let's say that you were going to make some burgers for a barbecue and you went to get some ground beef. What's the best way to market it? As 20% fat or 75% lean? It's the same exact thing, right? It's the same exact thing that people are going to be consuming, but it's the way that you frame it that incites them to buy it. More of it one way or the other. Of course, people are more likely to buy the 75% lean, right? Or let's say with surgery, there's a 90% chance success rate, whereas your doctor said there's like a 10% chance that you're going to die. Whoa, that sounds like a really big percentage for something like death. But on the same exact other way of looking at it, a 90% chance success rate that you're going to be just fine is wonderful, right? It's opposing the information or presenting it differently so that we have two different ways of seeing it. Next up is belief bias and belief perseverance. A bias is the tendency for one's pre-existing beliefs to distort logical reasoning. sometimes by making invalid conclusions, and that you're so stuck on what your beliefs are that you're biasing your logical reasoning in other areas because you'd rather just stick with what you believe in. Belief perseverance is our tendency to cling to our beliefs in the face of contradicting evidence. So if you believe the grass is purple, it's a silly example, I know, but work with me here. I could show you every piece of scientific evidence, bring in an expert on grasses and an expert on colors, and prove to you that grass is not really green, it's purple. Well, if you stick with your belief perseverance, you would miss out on a whole type of grass that is found in Kentucky that is actually purple.